History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 6 The Great Acceleration. Chapter 2 Political Change in an Age of Revolution. The British lost the war which followed because of the difficulties imposed by geography, because American generalship succeeded in avoiding superior forces long enough to preserve an army which could impose its will on them at Saratoga in 1777, because the French entered the war soon afterwards to win a return match for the defeat of 1763, and because the Spanish followed them and thus tipped the balance of naval power. The British had a further handicap. They dared not fight the kind of war which might win military victory by terrorizing the American population and thus encouraging those who wished to remain under the British flag to cut off the supplies and freedom of movement which General Washington's army enjoyed. They could not do this because their overriding aim had to be to keep open the way to a conciliatory peace with colonists, willing again to accept British rules. In these circumstances, the Bourbon coalition was fatal. The military decision came in 1781 when a British army found itself trapped at Yorktown between the Americans on land and a French squadron at sea. Only 7,000 or so men were involved, but their surrender was the worst humiliation yet undergone by the British arms and the end of an era of imperial rule. Peace negotiations soon began, and 2 years later, at Paris, a treaty was signed in which the Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America, whose territory the British negotiators had already conceded should run to the Mississippi. This was a crucial decision in the shaping of a new nation. The French, who had envisaged making a recovery in the Mississippi Valley, were disappointed. The northern continent was to be shared by the rebels only with Spain and Great Britain, it appeared. For all the loose ends which had to be tied up, and some boundary disputes which dragged on for decades to come, the appearance of a new state of great potential resources in the Western Hemisphere was, by any standard, certainly a revolutionary change. If it was at first often seen as something less than this by foreign observers, that was because the weaknesses of the new nation were at the time more apparent than its potential. Indeed, it was far from clear that it was a nation at all. The colonies were divided, and many expected them to fall to quarreling and disunion. Their great and inestimable advantage was their remoteness. They could work out their problems virtually untroubled by foreign intervention, a blessing crucial to much that was to follow. Victory in the war was followed by a half dozen critical years during which a handful of American politicians took decisions which were to shape much of the future history of the world. As in all civil wars and wars of independence, new divisions had been created which accentuated political weakness. Among these, those which divided loyalists from rebels were, for all their bitterness, perhaps the least important. That problem had been solved brutally by immigration of the defeated. Something like 80,000 loyalists left the rebel colonies for a variety of motives ranging from dislike of intimidation and terror to simple loyalty to the crown. Other divisions were likely to cause more trouble in the future. Class and economic interests separated farmers, merchants, and plantation owners. There were important differences between the new states which had replaced the former colonies and between the regions or sections of a rapidly developing country. One of these, that imposed by the economic importance of black slavery to the southern states, was to take decades to work out. On the other hand, the Americans also had great advantages as they set about nation building. They faced the future without the incubus of a huge illiterate and backward peasant population, such as stood in the way of evolving a democratic system in many other countries. They had ample territory and great economic resources, even in their existing areas of occupation. Finally, they had European civilization to draw upon, subject only to the modifications its legacies might undergo in transplantation to a virgin or near virgin continent. The war against the British had imposed a certain discipline. Articles of Confederation had been agreed between the former colonies and came into force in 1781. In them appeared the name of the new nation, the United States of America. The peace brought a growing sense that these arrangements were unsatisfactory. There were two areas of particular concern. One was disturbance arising fundamentally from disagreement about what the revolution ought to have meant in domestic affairs. The central government came to many Americans to appear to be far too weak to deal with disaffection and disorder. The other arose from a post war economic depression, particularly affecting external trade and linked to currency problems arising from the independence of individual states. To deal with these as well, the central government seemed ill equipped. It was accused of neglecting American economic interest in its conduct of relations with other countries. Whether true or not, this was widely believed. The outcome was a meeting of delegates from the states in a constitutional convention at Philadelphia in 1787. After 4 months' work, they signed a draft constitution, which was then submitted to the individual states for ratification. When 9 states had ratified it, the Constitution came into effect in the summer of 1788. In April 1789, George Washington, the former commander of the American forces in the war against the British, took the oath of office as the first president of the new republic, thus inaugurating a series of presidencies which has continued unbroken to this day. Much was said about the need for simple institutions and principles, clear in their intention, yet the new constitution was still to be revealing its potential for development 200 years later. For all the determination of its drafters to provide a document which would unambiguously resist reinterpretation, they were fortunately unsuccessful. The United States Constitution was to prove capable of spanning a historical epoch which turned a scatter of largely agricultural societies into a giant and industrial world power. In part, this was because of the provision for conscious amendment, but in larger measure, it was due to the evolving interpretation of the doctrines it embodied. But also much remained unchanged. Though often formal, these features of the constitutions are very important. Besides them, too, there were fundamental principles which were to endure, even if there was much argument about what they might mean. To begin with, the most obvious fact the Constitution was republican. This was by no means normal in the 18th century and should not be taken for granted. Some Americans felt that republicanism was so important and so insecure that they even disapproved of the Constitution because they thought it, and particularly its installation of a president as the head of the executive, squinted towards monarchy, as one of them put it. The ancient republics were as familiar to classically educated Europeans for their tendency to decay and faction as for their legendary, admirable morals. The history of the Italian republics was unpromising too, and much more unedifying than that of Athens and Rome. Republics in the 18th century Europe were few and apparently unflourishing. They seemed to persist only in small states, though it was conceded that the remoteness of the United States might protect Republican forms which would elsewhere ensure the collapse of a large state. Still, observers were not sanguine about the new nation. The later success of the United States was therefore to be of incalculable importance in reversing opinion about republicanism. Very soon, its capacity to survive, its cheapness, and a liberalism mistakenly thought to be inseparable from it focused the attention of critics of traditional governments all over the civilized world. European advocates of political change soon began to look to America for inspiration. Soon, too, the influence of the Republican example was to spread from the northern to the southern American continent. The second characteristic of the new constitution, which was of fundamental importance, was that its roots lay largely in British political experience. Besides the law of England, whose common law principles passed into the jurisprudence of the new state, this was true also of the actual arrangement of the government. The founding fathers had all grown up in the British colonial system in which elected assemblies had debated the public interest with monarchical governors. They instituted a bicameral legislature, although they excluded any hereditary element in its composition on the English model to offset a president. They thus followed English constitutional theory in putting a monarch, albeit an elected one, at the head of the executive machinery of the government. Though, in a different sense, the British had an elected monarchy. This was not how the British Constitution of the 18th century actually worked, but it was a good approximation to its appearance. The founding fathers took, in fact, the best constitution they knew, purged it of its corruptions as they saw them, and added modifications appropriate to American political and social circumstance. What they did not do was to emulate the alternative principle of government available in contemporary Europe, monarchical absolutism. Even in its enlightened form, the Americans wrote a constitution for free men because they believed that the British already lived under one. They thought it had failed only insofar as it had been corrupted, and that it had been improperly employed to deprive Americans of the rights they too ought to have exercised under it. Because of this, the same principles of government, albeit in much evolved forms, would one day be propagated and patronized in areas which shared none of the cultural assumptions of the Anglo Saxon world on which they rested. One way in which the United States differed radically from most other existing states and diverged consciously from the British constitutional model was in adherence to the principle of federalism. This was indeed fundamental to it, since only large concessions to the independence of individual states made it possible for the new union to come into existence at all. The former colonies had no wish to set up a new central government which would bully them as they believed the government of King George had done. The federal structure provided an answer to the problem of diversity, e pluribus unum. It also dictated much of the form and content of American politics for the next 80 years. Question after question, whose substance was economic or social or ideological, would find itself pressed into the channels of a continuing debate about what were the proper relations of the central government and the individual states. It was a debate which would in the end come within an inch of destroying the Union. Federalism would also promote a major readjustment within the Constitution, the rise of the Supreme Court as an instrument of judicial review. Outside the Union, the 19th century would reveal the appeal of federalism to many other countries impressed by what appeared to have been achieved by the Americans. Federalism was to be seen by European liberals as a crucial device for reconciling unity with freedom, and British governments found it a great standby in their handling of colonial problems. Finally, in any summary, however brief, of the historic significance of the Constitution of the United States, attention must be given to its opening words, "We, the people," even though they seem to have been included almost casually. The actual political arrangements in several of the states of 1789 were by no means democratic, but the principle of popular sovereignty was enunciated clearly from the start. In whatever form the mythology of a particular historical epoch might cloak it, the popular will was to remain the ultimate court of appeal in politics for Americans. Here was a fundamental departure from British constitutional practice, and it owed something to the way in which 17th century colonists had sometimes given themselves constitutions. Yet, British constitutionalism was prescriptive. The sovereignty of the king in parliament was not there because the people had once decided it should be, but because it was there and was unquestioned. As the great English constitutional historian Maitland once put it, Englishmen had taken the authority of the crown as a substitute for the theory of the state. The new constitution broke with this and with every other perspective theory. Although not with the British political thinking, for Locke had said in the 1680s that governments held their power on trust and that the people could upset governments which abused that trust. And on this ground, among others, some Englishmen had justified the Glorious Revolution. The American adoption of a democratic theory that all governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, as it had been put in the Declaration of Independence, was epoch marking. But it by no means solved the problems of political authority at a stroke. Many Americans feared what a democracy might do and sought to restrict the popular element in the political system right from the start. Another problem was suggested by the fundamental rights set out in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution at the end of 1789. These were presumably as much open to re-amendment at the hands of popular sovereignty as any other part of the Constitution. Here was an important source of disagreement for the future. Americans have always found it easy to be somewhat confused, especially in the affairs of other countries, but even in their own at times, about whether democratic principles consist in following the wishes of the majority or in upholding certain fundamental rights. Nevertheless, the de facto adoption of the democratic principle in 1787 was immensely important and justifies the consideration of the Constitution as a landmark in world history. For generations to come, the new United States would become the focus of aspirations of men longing to be free the world over. The world's last best hope, as one American once memorably said. Even today, when America so often appears conservative and inward looking, the democratic ideal of which for so long it was the custodian and exemplar retains its powers in many countries, and the institutions it fertilized are still working. Paris was the center of social and political discussion in Europe. To it returned some of the French soldiers who had helped to bring to birth the young American Republic. It is hardly surprising then that although most European nations responded in some measure to the transatlantic revolution, Frenchmen were specially aware of it. American example and the hopes it raised were a contribution, though a subsidiary one, to the huge release of forces which is still, after 200 years and many subsequent risings, called the French Revolution. Unfortunately, this all too familiar and simple term puts obstacles in the way of understanding. Politicians and scholars have offered many different interpretations of what the essence of the revolution was, have disagreed about how long it went on and what were its results, and even about when it began. They agree about little except that what happened in 1789 was very important. Within a very short time, indeed, it changed the whole concept of revolution, though there was much in it that looked to the past rather than to the future. It was a great boiling over of a pot of French society, and the pot's contents were a jumbled mixture of conservative and innovative elements, much like those of the 1640s in England, and equally confused in their mixture of consciousness and unconsciousness of direction and purposes too. This confusion was the symptom of big dislocations and maladjustments in the material life and government of France. She was the greatest of European powers, and her rulers neither could nor wished to relinquish her international role. The first way in which the American Revolution had affected her was by providing an opportunity for revenge. Yorktown was the retaliation for defeat at the hands of the British in the Seven Years' War, and to deprive them of the 13 colonies was some compensation for the French loss of India and Canada. Yet the successful effort was costly. The second great consequence was that for no considerable gain beyond the humiliation of a rival, France added yet another layer to the huge and accumulating debt piled up by her efforts since the 1630s to build and maintain a European supremacy. Attempts to liquidate this debt and cut the monarchy free from the cramping burden it imposed, and it was becoming clear after 1783 that France's real independence in foreign affairs was narrowing sharply because of it, were made by a succession of ministers under Louis XVI, the young, somewhat obtuse, but high principled and well meaning king who came to the throne in 1774. None of them succeeded in even arresting the growth of the debt, let alone in reducing it. What was worse, their effects only advertised the facts of failure. The deficit could be measured, and the figures published as would never have been possible under Louis XIV. If there was a spectre haunting France in the 1780s, it was not that of revolution but of state bankruptcy. The whole social and political structure of France stood in the way of tapping the wealth of the better off, the only sure way of emerging from the financial impasse. Ever since the days of Louis XIV himself, it had proved impossible to levy a due weight of taxation on the wealth without resorting to force. For French legal and social assumptions and the mass of privileges, special immunities, and the pres- prescriptive rights they upheld blocked the way ahead. The paradox of 18th century European government was at its most evident in France. A theoretically absolute monarchy could not infringe the mass of liberties and rights which made up the essentially medieval constitution of the country without threatening its own foundations. Monarchy itself rested on prescription. To more and more Frenchmen, it appeared that France needed to reform her governmental and constitutional structure if she was to emerge from her difficulties. But some went further. They saw in the inability of government to share fiscal burdens equitably between classes the extreme example of a whole range of abuses which needed reform. The issue was more and more exaggerated in terms of polarities, of reason and superstition, of freedom and slavery, of humanitarianism and greed. Above all, it tended to concentrate on the symbolic question of legal privilege. The class which focused the anger this aroused was the nobility, an immensely diverse and very large body. There seemed to have been between 200,000 and 250,000 noble males in France in 1789, about which cultural, economic, or social generalization is impossible, but whose members all shared a legal status which, in some degree, conferred privilege at law. While the logic of financial extremity pushed the governments of France more and more towards conflict with the privileged, there was a natural unwillingness on the part of many of the royal advisers themselves, usually noblemen, and of the king himself to proceed except by agreement when in 1788 a series of failures nerved the government to accept that conflict was inevitable. It still sought to confine it to legal channels, and like Englishmen in 1640, turned to historic institutions for means to do so. Not having parliament to hand, they trundled out from the attic of French constitutionalism, the nearest thing to a national representative body that France had ever possessed, the Estates General. This body of representatives of nobles, clergy, and commoners had not met since 1614. It was hoped that it would provide sufficient moral authority to squeeze agreement from the fiscally privileged for the payment of higher taxes. It was an unimpeachable constitutional step, but as a solution had the disadvantage that great expectations were aroused, while what the States General could legally do was obscure. More than one answer was given. Some were already saying that the States General could legislate for the nation, even if historic and undoubted legal privileges were at issue. This very complicated political crisis was coming to a head at the end of a period in which France was also under other strains. One was population growth. Since the second quarter of the century, this had risen at what a later age would think a slow rate, but was still fast enough to outstrip growth in the production of food. This sustained a long run inflation of food prices, which bore most painfully upon the poor, the vast majority of whom were peasants with little or no land. Given the coincidence of the fiscal demands of government, which for a long time staved off the financial crisis by borrowing or by putting up the direct and indirect taxes which fell most heavily on the poor, and the efforts of landlords to protect themselves in inflationary times by holding down wages and putting up rents and dues, the life of the poor was growing harsher and more miserable for most of the century. To this general impoverishment should be added the special troubles that from time to time afflicted particular regions or classes, but which coincidentally underwent something of an intensification in the second half of the 1780s. Bad harvests, cattle disease, and recession, which badly affected the areas where peasants' families produced textiles as a supplement to their income, all sapped the precarious health of the economy in the 1780s. The sum effect was that the elections to the Estates General in 1789 took place in a very excited and embittered atmosphere. Millions of Frenchmen were desperately seeking some way out of their troubles, were eager to seek and blame scapegoats, and had quite unrealistic and inflated notions of what good the king, whom they had trusted, could do for them. Thus, a complex interplay of governmental impotence, social justice, economic hardship, and reforming aspiration brought about the French Revolution. But before this complexity is lost to sight in the subsequent political battles and the simplifying slogans they generated, it is important to emphasize that almost no one either anticipated this outcome or desired it. There was much social injustice in France, but no more than many other 18th century states found it possible to live with. There was a welter of expectant and hopeful advocates of particular reforms, ranging from the abolition of the censorship to the prohibition of immoral and irreligious literature. But no one doubted that such changes could easily be carried out by the king, once he was informed of his people's wishes and needs. What did not exist was a party of revolution clearly confronting a party of reaction.